Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the expansion of absolutism throughout European history, right? So we got into the nitty-gritty a little bit talking about the expansion of absolutism in Russia, right? We're going to get a little bit confusing today, and it's going to be fine because we're right now currently playing around a little bit with timelines, all right? Because we actually talked about something before this that happened actually after this, and some of y'all are like, Mother Dare, why would you do that? Because it's really quick when you're looking at the expansion of absolutism in general. It's always really important that you talk about Louis XIV first, right? Why do we talk about Louis XIV first? Because he's like kind of the marquee guy, right? He is the marquee example of absolutism, right? The dude that becomes the most powerful figure in all of Europe, that has a massive war with the rest of Europe because of the War of Spanish Succession, that actually grows his influence, builds the Palace of Versailles, and says, I am the state, right? Like that guy is a very good example of the growth of absolutism. And then we end up talking about Russia. Now, here's the weird thing about all this. All of the stuff that we're talking about in Russia right now actually happened before Louis XIV, right? Actually, like, Ivan the Terrible came to power around, like, the 1540s, right? Comes to power in the 1540s, and, like, Louis is not even going to be born for another, like, 100 years, right? Like, so, which is absolutely bananas. And some of you are like, Mr. Terry, why would you do this to me? Because the guy, Ivan the Terrible, is going to set up the actual, like, things that are going to give the potential possibility of this other guy from Russia who's going to show up in a little while, the ability to become a modern absolutist right after the death of Louis XIV, right? So the big thing about it, though, is we left off in class talking about the growth of Russia, right? We talked about how they were originally conquered by the Mongols and stuff like that, and how Ivan III, right, Ivan the Great, is going to break away the small city of Muscovy away from the Mongolians and begin to push them back, right? Well, his son's going to come along and do some good work and continue to expand the state of Muscovy, but the thing about it is when the Russians actually, when Muscovy actually conquers the entire big chunk western area of what you now know as modern-day Russia, and then also this area to the north known as the Novgorod Republic. Whenever they do this, they crown their first Tsar, right? That's a big thing that we need to make sure that we have written down and our understanding of. The fact that basically Ivan is going to be one of the guys that comes along, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth, comes along when he's like in his youth, right, in his late teens, going into his 20s, and he pushes the Mongols back even further, creating the Russia that you now know of today, right? The Russia that expands all the way north towards the Baltic Sea and modern-day Finland, right? Going all the way south towards the Black Sea, butting up against the Ottoman Empire, and then also heading out west towards Siberia, all right? Now, Ivan, though, as he continues to push like all these Mongols back, he of course gets married, right? Gets married to the young Romanov princess by the name of Anastasia Romanova, right? And of course that's going to be right there the integration into the Russian royal line of the Romanov family, right? That is going to be very important a little bit later because they're going to rule over Russia for, 300 years. So getting into it though, you also need to understand that Ivan is going to do all these things, right? And he's actually going to be a decently solid administrative ruler early on. That's why we always love to ask the question, was he really that terrible, right? Well, the thing about it is, like, the word that they actually use in Russian to say terrible is they called him all the time Ivan Grozny, right? Ivan Grozny. Grozny means terrible in Russian, but it doesn't have to necessarily say moral connotation that we use it with English, right? When we say terrible, when we're talking about Ivan the Terrible in English, we think of malevolent, intense, too over the top, evil, like kills and murders people. Did Ivan do a lot of that? Possibly. So, like, now we'll talk about that here in about 2 seconds, and I know Grace Wilson already knows little elements of this story, right? But getting into it, though, a little bit, you gotta understand that he gets married to his wife, Anastasia Romanova. He pushes the Mongols back, and he creates the very first, like, absolutist institutions that are gonna exist in that of Russia, right? He creates important things that is because he comes to power as the very first Tsar, right? By the way, there's 2 different ways to spell the word Tsar, right? You got Tsar, T-S-A-R, which is how we spell it, I believe, in Russian. And then you have also the other spelling that is C-Z-A-R, right? Because that's actually where the word Tsar originally comes from. It actually is a, like, offshoot of the word Caesar, right? Like, so, like, as in, like, Caesar, the Roman, like, dictator and stuff like that. Because he was such an important figure in history, they named their kings and, like, rulers Caesars, right? So going into it, though, also, he creates those important absolutes and, like, institutions. Some of those include the fact that, first of all, Ivan is going to create the very first standing army that anybody has ever seen, known as the Streltsy, all right? So long before all these other professional armies start popping up all over European history, about 100 years early, Ivan actually does this, right? He creates the Streltsy, and he actually uses the standing army to conquer other areas outside of what Russia was when he actually took power. And he uses it to continue to expand his land and push the Mongols back, right? Another big thing he does is he actually organizes the Russian feudal system by creating new lands and granting it to these noble boyars, right? And he also solidifies the feudal system so it actually can provide Russia with food, goods, services, and economic value. And the other big thing about it going along to it as well while, he creates the Russian feudal parliament, right? Which is actually going to be a really interesting thing, very kind of Louis-esque, where he actually creates a Russian feudal parliament with high-ranking noble families and high-ranking boyar families that are actually going to be loyal to him and his administration, right? And this like Russian feudal parliament, you don't need to know what it's called, but I love knowing what it's called. It's called the Zemsky Sabor, right? So now look, the big thing about it, I love Russian. The Russian language is like so great because it's like Ivan the Grozny, Zemsky Sabor, Streltsy, and we'll talk about another one here in about 2 seconds, which is like Oprichnina and Oprichniki. But the thing about it though is he does all of this mostly for the part while his wife is alive, right? But unfortunately, what's going to happen is the death of this poor woman is going to really shatter this man's entire existence, okay? They did have several surviving children, 2 of those being 2 sons though, right? So we do have some heirs to the throne coming even after she dies. He doesn't have any other surviving children with any of the rest of his wives, and he goes on to have 5 more wives, right? And they die from a bunch of random other stuff as well. But it is considered to be the death of his wife is like almost the turning point of his entire existence. He goes from being a monarch that can be controlled by, not controlled by her, but actually soothed by her, somebody with a possibility of having bipolar disorder, because we believe that the thing about it is he may have had paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, but he was prone to extreme violent fits, right? But when his wife died, he immediately starts freaking out, and he actually starts blaming a lot of the boyars for her death. And he is convinced in this entire time, he's like, just like my mother, they poisoned my wife to try and get back at me, these scumbag boyars that I will now destroy. So the thing about it though is, interestingly, y'all, have we done modern-day medical testing on the bones of Anastasia Romanova and found that actually it is very likely that she was poisoned? I know. So, like, now, the funny thing about it is then Ivan goes on a campaign of being pretty terrible, right? Even though he did this, right? He did do this and grew Russia to be very, very large, because as we can actually see underneath the like territorial, like, where'd it go? Yeah, Ivan the Great is going to expand it all the way to this different area. It's also going to like continue to grow under some of his later descendants, including his son and stuff like that. But then also he's very, very well known and famous for having this bad boy built, right? This is St. Basil's Cathedral. But interesting little thing about it is after the death of his wife, it's when all these crazy stories about him being super violent and very, very aggressive pop up, right? According to one famous legend, he had the eyeballs of the architect that built St. Basil's Cathedral burned out of his head so he would never be able to make a building as beautiful. Now, that's probably not true. But the thing about it, though, is with this legend, who said this, right? It's probably those boyars, right? Because the big thing you need to understand about this entire thing is he started a campaign of trying to actually suppress the power of the boyar family, right? Just like Penelope said with the boyardee, right? Of course, the chef hat and the ravioli in a can. All right, so like, now look, big thing about it, though, as well, is he starts a campaign of trying to execute, murder, and destroy entire boyar families, right? Boyar families, particularly from this area known as Novgorod, right? Novgorod is the northern area of Russia, so if you like take the bottom part of Russia, the top part up here, right? He actually does a lot of these different things, and you can actually like sometimes look it up as known as the Massacre of Novgorod, because these are the conquered northern territories, right? And what he was very, very well known for doing is sending in a very, very large secret police force, right? He referred to this place, all right, Novgorod, like this area, as his Oprichnina, right? Oprichnina is actually the area that he believes is apart from him or not going with him, okay? And he's actually referring to the boyars and stuff like that, and we refer to this period of Russian history as the Oprichnina because it's when he's actually trying to bring the boyars under his control. And he oftentimes would send in his secret police. His secret police is known as the Oprichniki, right? And the Oprichniki would actually be sent in to destroy noble homes, burn their stuff down, kill the people that resided inside the homes, and then he would then replace them with these people called service nobles. Nobles that are loyal to him, right? These service nobles actually mirror kind of the intent and execution of the robe nobles in France, right? The robe nobles who bought their way into this entire thing. The big difference between it, though, is that Ivan actually, instead of actually letting them buy their way into the service nobility, he actually just killed a bunch of families and then gave their family to people that would be loyal to him, right? So, like, now, you could say he's probably kind of terrible, right? So, like, there's actually one famous incident in particular where right here, he is surrounded by his Oprichniki, right? These are his secret police right here, and this is actually a writer, right? A writer from the Novgorod territories who actually wrote an inflammatory article about Ivan, and he actually goes, "You think you can do better than me? You should be Tsar," and apparently dressed him up in a Tsar outfit and stuff like that to humiliate him, and then actually apparently Ivan jumped on him and then stabbed him to death, right? Like, so now look, big thing about it, though, is that person that was a writer from the Novgorod Novgorod territories was also one of the famous boyars, right? He is one of those boyars that he is actually trying to suppress and take all that land and power away from, right? So going into it, though, also, as we know as well, is that this is going to cause a lot of hysteria. You're going to see a lot of runaway serfs. You're going to see a lot of people running away to the outskirts, like towards Siberia and stuff like that. And what they would actually do is, like, a lot of these serfs, as they begin to ran away, and a lot of these, like, different individuals that lived out in Siberia, and some of these nobles that begin to ran away and stuff like that, they kind of form these big bands of, like, land pirates is what I like to call them. These people that were basically like rebellious groups of people out towards the east that, like, Ivan and, of course, later, like, Russian rulers are going to have to deal with. And they're called Cossacks, right? Like, so, like, now the Cossacks apparently lived out in the east, and they were a constant nuisance to the, like, czars going forward, right? Particularly, in essence, when we talk about Catherine the Great, she's going to have to deal with the Cossack Rebellion, where one guy says, like, I am her husband that was supposedly died, and, like, all this other stuff. So going into it, though, when we're looking at it, you have to understand also that Ivan is going to enforce some new standards because of this, right? Because of a lot of these serfs running away, because of the hysteria caused by him actually suppressing the Novgorod territories and having a lot of these nobles murdered, he actually says that, oh, you run away? You are then directly violating the laws of the Tsar, and you can be executed, right? So he actually enforces new harsh standards on serfs, making it so they have to stay on that land, and if they ever try to run away, they can be corporally punished, right? Now, this is, of course, like, emblematic and mirrors those ideas that we talked about at the very beginning of this unit, that Eastern European idea, where feudalism is actually becoming more entrenched into the Eastern European society during this time, whereas in the West, they're going to start moving away from it very, very slowly, right? Now, going into it, though, also, you have to understand, though, and Ivan, of course, though, is not going to live forever, right? So who the heck is going to be taking over after the death of Ivan the Terrible when that time does actually come, right? Well, the thing about it is everybody's pretty excited, and they're like, oh, it's not going to be fine. We're going to be totally, totally fine, because we've got Ivan Jr. stepping up, right? We've got this Ivan. Right here's actually a picture, apparently, a painting of Ivan the Terrible, happily watching his son ride his horse away. Ivan the Terrible is on the black horse. Ivan, his son, Ivan Ivanovich, is actually riding on the white horse, and he was a strapping, smart young man that everybody was excited that he was going to take over one day and it was all going to be fine, right? And also, as well, Ivan Ivanovich, Ivan Jr., is already married, too, right? He's married to a famous boyar woman, like a boyar family, like, woman. And also, fun fact as well, they might have a little baby on the way. So, like, now, what interestingly enough happens, though, in the entire progression of the story, is what happens in the long run is Ivan was very well known for having very big meals once a week, right? And he'd have them with his family, and of course, Ivan Ivanovich, Ivan Jr., would be sitting very close to him, towards the head of the table, and poor Fedor, he's down there at the end of the table minding his own business. He didn't even want to come out of his room, probably, right? Didn't want to come out of his room. Fedor, the bell ringer, would much rather just sit in his room, pray, do his thing, maybe color, you know, so, like, and just live his life. Oh, poor Fedor. He's so cute. But the big thing about it, though, looking at it, apparently, according to legend and story, is that at that dinner, Ivan had one of his violent fits, right? And he looked over at the wife of his son, Ivan Jr. He looks over at him and goes, or like looks over at her and goes, why do you dress this way at my table? Because her body had begun to change, right? Her body had begun to change. Her chest began to swell and stuff like that because she was actually pregnant, right? And they just hadn't told anybody yet because you don't want to tell anybody during this time period because if you lose the baby, it can be very heartbreaking, right? The thing about it, though, is he then apparently beat Ivan Jr.'s wife in front of Ivan Jr.'s face, causing his wife to have a miscarriage, and they lost their child, right? And then apparently this led to a huge argument between Ivan Jr. and his father, Ivan the Terrible, right? And he goes like, how dare you, like, do this to her? Everybody, when you die, is going to be fine because I'm going to take over. And Ivan the Terrible had a question of the moment of loyalty, right? And according to the story, Ivan the Terrible then looked down into his right hand, grabbed a scepter that he had, turned it around, and it had a sharp point on the end of it, and then apparently he lunged it into his own son's side of his skull, stabbed him, and killed him instantly, right? Stabbing it into his son's temple, and boom, and it just like killed the strapping heir to the entire throne of Russia, right? Causing him to collapse to the ground dead, and then Ivan apparently dropped the scepter and then collapsed down, grabbed his son, and held him and cried, right? So as you can tell, we think that there might be actually some credence to all this like bipolarism and stuff like that, and these violent fits. But what we do know that ends up happening, though, is Ivan is now dead. So y'all, who does that mean is now going to have to take over the throne? Fedor. So like now Fedor then becomes the next king of Russia, right? He becomes the next czar of Russia, and all he does is manage to sustain it. He grows the territory a tiny little bit, but he wasn't a very authoritarian king. He's not like his dad and stuff like that. All he loved to do was just go look at churches and ring the bells, y'all. And he never had any kids, right? Like he never had any children. So when Fedor dies, the infrastructure that Ivan had actually set up collapsed, leading to this time period known as the Time of Troubles, right? The Time of Troubles is going to be a very interesting time when Poland, ironically enough, invades Russia and wins, right? So now, they invade Russia during the Time of Troubles, win several territorial gains, and Russia goes through a very tumultuous time period where they're trying to figure out who the front door is going to lead after the death of Fedor, right? Because Fedor did his best, y'all. He did his best. Like, I love Fedor. Like, he did his best. If Fedor can rule Russia, you can pass the AP test, all right? Remember that in the back of your mind, all right? Now, going into it, though, as well, since Fedor died childless, what is going to happen now is the Russians are going to have to frantically scramble to figure out who is going to take on the next czarship, right? And what ends up happening is they select Mikhail, when you say it in Russian, Mikhail Romanov, who's going to be elected as the next czar. Using the Russian feudal parliament and the boyar families, they agree that the Romanovs are the closest living family members, right? Because of the actual marriage of Ivan the Terrible to Anastasia Romanova, right? So since she was the Romanov princess, they're now integrated into the royal line of succession. So boom, the Romanovs actually take over. And who that is Ivan's grandnephew, right? Now the thing about it, they're looking at this as well, the Romanov family is then going to successfully rule over the throne of Russia for the next 300 years. All right, so like that, for the next 300 years, you have a Romanov on the throne of Russia consistently from start to finish of that 300-year time period. That's insane. And they, of course, do not die out until Nicholas II is the last Tsar of Russia, and you know him famously as being shot in that basement with his entire family, and his daughter's name was Anastasia. Right? So big thing about it, though, going into it, we have one famous Romanov to talk about in the progression of absolute history, right? So going into it, though, now what we're going to be doing is basically, like, if we talked about, like, Ivan the Terrible over here, then some stuff with Louis happened here, we're now jumping down past Louis and then going all the way into the reign of Peter the Great. All right, so like now we've got actually the rise of Peter the Great, who is going to rule over Russia from 1682 to 1725, right? And he's going to become the most true image of a westernized absolutist when we're looking at the growth of Russia, right? Now, the thing that you got to ask yourself a little bit is Russia still kind of an Eastern-esque country, right? Like, when we look at pictures of Ivan the Terrible and stuff like that, he's wearing a winter coat, he's dressing some kind of, like Eastern style, more like Eastern-derived clothing, he's got facial hair, right? He also, like, of course, St. Basil's Cathedral is built with a little bit of Mongolian-style architecture and some stuff like that, or Eastern-style architecture with its belled domes, and it's as an Eastern Orthodox church, they do have some Eastern elements to them. The thing about it, though, is you got to ask yourself, but are they still Eastern? Well, not after Peter the Great, because this Peter the Great, this Romanov king and stuff like that, the Tsar of Russia, is going to go on a campaign of trying to westernize Russia and bring them in as a European power, right? So before this entire thing, Ivan the Terrible created a solid Russian state, right? His son Fedor then takes over, and the subsequent Romanovs that rule from about 1613 to 1682, which is only about like 4 or 5 of them, are going to create a strong Russia, but not a truly like European Russia, right? Not a European Russia that makes waves. Not a European Russia that's heavily involved in economics. Not a European Russia that's like super into like military growth and strength and stuff like that. It is Peter the Great that comes along and puts Russia, i.e., on the map of Europe, right? Politically, socially, economically speaking, and also militarily speaking, right? So going into it, you have to understand that he is going to create that Western version of Russia. Because looking at Ivan the Great again really, really quick, look at how this dude looks, right? And then tell me really fast, looking at Peter the Great, look how he dresses and looks, right? Very, very stylistically different, okay? He looks much more like he could be from France. He looks much more like he could be from somewhere else. He looks much more like he could be from one of the Western areas of like Europe, because he's wearing the fashions, right? He's actually sitting, of course, in front of a bay. There's water in the background. There's a modern-day cannon next to him. He's got his hand over top of like a globe and then a very, very like large map underneath his arm, right? So as you can see, he is trying to create Russia into a more Western European identity area, right? And he does this successfully when he's a very, very young man. He actually goes on this thing known as his Grand Tour, right? He actually goes on his Grand Tour from 1697 to 1698. It's an 18-month tour of Western Europe where he takes a few hundred boyars with him, and he decides, let's go find out what makes the West so much more strong and intense than the East, right? And he goes on this really big thing, and he studies all these different European countries. He visits the Netherlands, he visits England, he visits the Holy Roman Empire, he visits France as well, and he learns something different from all of these places, right? He learns how to govern, like how to have a strong absolutist government in France. He also learns that when he visits France, the language of diplomacy and the language of people who speak of government, they speak in French, right? So like now, he also learns in this entire progress as well how to create more advanced weaponry and have a naval fleet and how to actually learn how to build boats when he goes and visits the Dutch. This is a really, really big moment. This is him actually visiting the Dutch in the Low Countries and stuff like that. And also apparently, check this out, apparently he went in disguise, right? Like he went in disguise, he was like, no one knows I'm here. No one knows I'm here. I'm just going to check out all this cool stuff. I'm just some Russian rich guy. I'm not the king of Russia or anything like that. Really, really quick thing, though. It's pretty hard to not recognize him because he was 6'8". He was huge, right? Like, the dude was super tall. Like, he was, like, 6'8", but he had really, really small hands and feet. So super small hands, like, very, very small feet, and then also a small head. So he's a kind of awkward, like, wonky-looking dude. So he's pretty easy to spot, right? But also, apparently, even when he went and visited France, he actually held the young French king in his arms. This right here is actually Louis the 15th, right? Louis the 15th that takes over after Louis the 14th, and he actually went and when he visited Versailles, and he picked him up, and he held him, and he was like, you're going to be such a cute king. Now, this isn't originally on his grand tour. He actually goes and does this later, because as we know already, that Louis the 14th doesn't actually die until about 1714, 1715. And so the big thing about it, though, is on this grand tour, he wants Russia to be emerging as a very much a Western European power, right? He's blown away by the power that is brought by trade, using the Dutch and East India companies, and he also wants to introduce a lot of new Western reforms to Russia, right? So big things about this include, right, some of these new reforms he wants to bring back to Russia is he wants to create nobles as civil servants, right? He wants to make them much more like a legislative branch, and he wants to make all the actions of the nobility, just like the robe nobles of that in France, to actually contribute towards the power and growth of the king, right? He wants to create an autocracy and an absolute government where the nobles work for you, not somebody you're working against, like Ivan the Terrible was dealing with for his entire reign, okay? Also, he required that all nobles go get at least 5 years of advanced schooling. This 5 years of advanced schooling is going to progress education standards throughout Russia, and it's going to create a system where the nobles are going to compete with each other over who is more educated, what do you know, and how can you better serve the king, right? Now, there's something really important that this is going to actually lead itself to, so do me a favor, put a little star next to that bad boy right there, right next to the requiring 5 years of schooling from home, and he also creates a common man standing army of over 200,000 people, and the nobles would be made officers in this military to, again, try to curry their favor and make their power more dependent on the Russian Tsar, right? Now, the thing about it, though, when we're looking at this as well, there's one hiccup and one problem when it comes to all the stuff that has to do with Peter the Great. The thing that he wanted more than anything else was to make Russia a trade power, right? He wanted to create Russia as a warm water trade port city with power to influence and trade different goods, just like the English and the Dutch did with their East India companies, right? And so it's all about warm water ports, y'all. He wants a warm water port. And if y'all want to watch a really, really cringy rap video, down in the description, I'm going to drop this thing by Tom Ritchie, but it's so funny, and it actually will help you study for this test, right? He literally does this entire rap as like Peter the Great and everything like that. He also does part of it as Louis the 14th, and it's very, very funny. He's ruling absolutely, apparently. It's very, very cute. You should definitely watch it. But the big thing about it, though, it's all about those warm water ports, y'all. Because the problem with it is that most of Russia's ports were frozen for a very large part of the year. He needs a warm water port that never freezes over. He tried to do this originally when he went against the Ottomans in the Black Sea, and the Black Sea is, of course, to the south of Russia. He goes down there originally, and he tries to figure out a way, can I create a warm water port in the Black Sea? Well, he does, and it's called the Port of Azov and stuff like that, but the problem is if you want to get out of the Black Sea, you got to sail through the Strait of Dardanelles, which then goes right back through the Ottoman Empire, right? So he kind of goes there and realizes that that's not going to be the key thing. Instead, he wants one to the north, right? But the problem is that the northern areas are controlled by the country of Sweden, right? The country of Sweden and a young 15-year-old king of Sweden named Charles, right? He goes up there, tries to start a war with him, known as the Great Northern War, and unfortunately, Russia fails. All right, so in the first phase of this war, Russia fails, but he realizes in that moment he needs to restructure and become even more Western. Develop a better navy, develop a better naval fleet, develop a better naval force, have a better military and stuff like that. So he comes back after creating more reforms, and he crushes the Swedish to gain access to the Baltic Sea, right? He does all of this, and he shows up, and he creates even more land. And on the land that he confiscated away from those Swedish people, he creates a new city, known as the capital of St. Petersburg after this victory. And he creates even more reforms, including one big one, known as the Table of Ranks. But we're going to wait until we're in class to talk about that bad boy, and I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.